So thanks for having us. So I will do a little preamble and then I'll let you know when I've started my bit, Richard, and I aim to go for about 20 minutes and then Bob will do the same and we'll take questions together. So the seminar today continues a dialogue that Bob and I have been having on and off about the relation of literature and education. It goes back to my first visit, I think, to the Association for Moral Education annual conference in about 2012. And the gist of our conversation is that we welcome the claim that literature educates, but we want to call for more engagement between discussions in contemporary literary studies of the educational potential of literature and discussions in educational studies about how literature might be employed or applied for educational purposes. In particular, we have in mind moral education, and today one among various available approaches, the relatively cohesive movement advocating Aristotelian character education, which I'll pin down more specifically in a few moments. So I'm very pleased to be presenting with Bob. I've captured our presentation maybe in this image of Don Quixote tilting at windmills. I touch briefly on this particular literary episode and how it's been treated in character education, and Bob's going to open out that discussion in his presentation that follows. But perhaps there's something also appropriate in our choice of that image as we discuss character education. So this is me starting my bit. So we're going to refer to a specific cluster of philosophers as key proponents of what I mean by character education of an Aristotelian kind, namely Christian Christiansen, David Carr and Walter Sanders. This selection is not entirely arbitrary. The three have worked together as colleagues in the Jubilee Centre for Character and Value at the University of Birmingham, a very well-funded interdisciplinary project combining philosophers, psychologists, sociologists and a range of practitioner partners. That's unquestionably the leading voice in character education in the UK and increasingly globally. Furthermore, it's been argued that what is intended by a non-expansive understanding of Aristotelian character education is sufficiently broad church to take in the work of other leading global influencers such as William Damon, William Kilpatrick, Thomas Licona, although their explicit engagement with Aristotle, Christiansen and Sanders argue, can be variable and occasionally needs to be sharpened with their specialist intervention. To put my own contribution in context, writing some time ago about moral education in Rousseau's Emile, I noted that advocates of Aristotelian character education tend to emphasize the heteronomy of their approach as a corrective to another approach that overly stresses the autonomy of the learner and which is sometimes claimed originated in Rousseau. I argue that the interplay of heteronomy and autonomy was more complex in Rousseau than advocates of character education had grasped. In particular, I was responding to the ethical philosopher Christina Hoff Sommers. And I argue that Rousseau's approach to the question of when a child is ready to be taught by exemplary moral stories had something important to teach character education, particularly with reference to an issue that continues to vex the field, namely whether the moral content of a story is something hard-won that calls for a carefully orchestrated pedagogy, or whether some artworks are of such power that they simply work their magic on the reader or viewer. And I began to sketch out a route through the autonomy-heteronomy distinction that stressed the dialogic ontology of exemplarity in moral formation. And I'm going to unpack that a little further today. And recently this has become a more central concern in my work. I'm currently editing the Routledge Literature and Education book series with Andrew Green. One of the central concerns of the series is an engagement between literary studies and educational studies on the question of how literature educates. In particular, I'm interested in the transformation that occurs when accounts of what you might call the self-educational relation of the literary work and the reader are transferred into a more self-consciously educational context. What follows is to an extent under the influence of the neo-phenomenology of Rita Felsky, who in turn draws on philosophical hermeneutics. And this is not the only approach to literary studies or even necessarily a representative one, but it's an approach that promises initially to be very hospitable to character education. Firstly, because there's an agreement with character educators that literature can, does, and should educate. That's a matter on which there has, of course, not ever been a general consensus in literary studies. Felsky argues that literary understanding presupposes a willingness to be transformed by the text, and she opposes this to various instrumental or critical approaches to literary interpretation, where we see through the author or approach the text looking for some particular information about the life and times of the work. And Gadamer has argued that we approach the text as a teacher. But what this means is that you do not read it in such a way that you know in advance what it has to teach you, but are prepared to encounter something unexpected. Now, already here, there's an indication of a tension between the account being offered of the educational potential of a literary work and the conscious decision to employ that work for educational purposes. If nothing else, we should note that if we take the text already to be in some way a teacher, a multiplication of teachers occurs when a teacher then picks up that text for some educational purpose. And it's worth noting also that the tradition of philosophical hermeneutics on which I'm drawing claims a significant debt to Aristotle, particularly in Gadamer's adoption of phronesis as the capacity at play in the interpretive event. This connection is not uncontroversial, particularly because it's been noted that although Aristotle offered a poetics, he did not himself provide a hermeneutics. Gadamer's questions were not Aristotle's questions, but Gadamer found in phronesis a capacity whose operation he claimed he could extend into interpretive areas where Aristotle had not previously applied it. However, educational readings of Aristotle that draw on Gadamer's interpretation, such as the work of Joe Dunn, have come under significant critique from Christian Christiansen. I don't want to get embroiled in an exegetical detour so much as to address substantive questions about the working of exemplarity that the Aristotelian character educators seem to have minimized or missed, or only to have circled around without quite alighting on them. I intend no particular criticism, obviously, of Aristotle for not having addressed these questions directly. In fact, I hope to show that certain hermeneutical problems are only brought sharply to light when the work of moral exemplars is transferred into explicitly pedagogical contexts in which Aristotle does not directly consider them. Although Aristotle offers a nuanced developmental account of how the individual moves from a non-virtuous to a virtuous state, he doesn't offer pedagogical guidance. Although he discusses the workings of exemplarity, that is, he doesn't explain either how to be an exemplar or how to employ an exemplar for educational purposes. This is the space, of course, that character education research is attempting to navigate. So I'm going to pass over this summary of the key selling points of character education and just direct you for that to the works of Christiansen, Sanders, and other key advocates. To get quickly to my critical point, you'll have to take my word for it that exemplarity plays a central role in character education's account of moral formation. Exemplarity here takes in not only literary works, but also the lives of exemplary historical figures and the teacher, him or herself, as exemplar. The workings of exemplarity have been acknowledged as problematic within character education, and a relatively recent issue of the Journal of Moral Education was devoted to this. Now, so far, discussion of exemplars has tended to focus on the question of the familiarity or unfamiliarity of the heroic exemplar. And that's a largely psychological concern about how far removed an exemplar can be from a student's own experience and self-image and still be effective. And there's been some discussion of whether exemplars are simply imitated or whether they are rather emulated, which again concerns a largely psychological question of motivation. And although Walter Sanders circles around this, there's been little focused discussion of how exemplars are interpreted, understood, or taken as such. This is a hermeneutical problem with significant implications for the character education project. Furthermore, it's not one which can be circumvented on the grounds that the project nevertheless works, because it puts into question what it might mean to make such a claim. That is, what is happening when exemplars do their work in a pedagogical context. An exemplar transforms when it's employed in a pedagogical context, when a teacher self-consciously acts as an exemplar or uses one or puts it to work. Now, what does it mean to say that understanding has a dialogic ontology? Gadamer's insight is that understanding occurs in the in-between space between reader and text. What understanding shares with dialogue in Gadamer's descriptive ontology is a to and fro movement. This is elaborated in terms of the Socratic logic of question and answer, characterized by the logical structure of openness. Gadamer writes, only the person who knows how to ask questions is able to persist in his questioning, which involves being able to preserve his orientation toward openness. The art of questioning is the art of questioning ever further, i.e. the art of thinking. Felsky, drawing on Marielle Massé, has described the event of literary understanding as the pas de deux of reader and text. Now, Christiansen, in a 2014 paper, recognises a dialogical turn in Aristotelian character education. But I want to argue that ultimately this doesn't refer to the to and fro dialectic of understanding, so much as the instrumental deployment of conversation for pedagogical purposes. Christiansen starts off very positively with regards to the thesis I want to elaborate. He points out a shift in emphasis in his own approach away from the time-honoured practice of telling a story and driving home its moral, towards a dialectical exchange between the exemplar and the learner. He notes that habituation is all the way up a critical practice. Now, Christiansen's recognition that habituation is always already dialogic is very significant indeed for my thesis, particularly because it acknowledges that the kind of dialogue implied must precede not only sophisticated moral discussion, but also any kind of spoken interaction whatsoever. Now, I'm going to develop this significance later, but I'll note for the time being that Christiansen returns to, if you like, an ontic rather than an ontological understanding of dialogue, when he argues for the need for open-ended dialogue tempered by a commitment to directive teaching, which is in turn based on a commitment to moral realism. Ultimately, Christiansen's take on dialogue is that it is a neglected pedagogical tool for the achievement of educational ends, rather than a precondition for how an exemplar is understood as such. I suggest that Christiansen could have gotten a lot further here. The dialogic ontology of exemplarity to which he gestures offers a way of addressing a long-standing problem in character education. Now, the psychologists of character education have long struggled with the perceived problem of the interpreter's pre-existing background or frame of understanding. So this is Darcia Naves observing in 2002 that when the text doesn't fit with the reader's background knowledge or schemas, readers will poorly understand, misrecall, and even distort memory to fit with their schematic form. Theme extraction, that's what Naves here calls the discerning the point or the moral of a story, even from simple texts, and the discussion is around the Three Little Pigs, proved difficult until age 10 and was not automatic or fundamental generally unless the topic was familiar. This has led in the Association for Moral Education, if you go to the conferences, to a tradition of papers that present research into the creation of new texts for moral pedagogical interventions that more effectively exemplify desired virtues and do so by reducing ambiguity and opportunities to subvert the intended message of the text. Needless to say, texts which moral psychologists might recognise as pedagogically effective less and less resemble anything that might be recognised as having literary merits. So yeah, I'm going to pass over the magic of great art. So David Carr and Bob Davis, in fact, collaborated on a paper, I think in 2007, on the dark side of literary art in education, in which they claimed that great literature is valuable precisely because its moral concerns are ambiguous. Artworks preserve the questionability of our traditions of value. Where they contribute to moral formation, it is by developing a sensitivity and attentiveness to matters of moral significance, rather than by conveying unambiguous moral knowledge. And in my own extended interpretation of Rousseau's treatment of the fable of the fox and the crow, I argued that the story suffers from an embarrassment of maîtres that in Rousseau's view confound interpretive attempts and led him to the recognition that ultimately what is exemplified in these moral tales is presupposed by the exemplar. Now, anyone who's tried to explain the fable of the boy who cried wolf to a young child, I think, may understand this phenomenon of circularity. Rather than teaching any sort of message, the fable recedes into the background understanding of the child, so that later on, when the child cries wolf, the parent can eagerly draw on that language and say that what you've just done, that's crying wolf, like in the fable. And in the same chapter where I elaborated on this, I pointed out how in Aesop's fables, we expect the moral to intrude, self-consciously acknowledging the fable's intended pedagogical role to regulate interpretation of the allegory and rule out illegitimate interpretations. And these kinds of pedagogical intrusions are characteristic of the texts of character education. So in Carr and Harrison's book on knightly virtues in relation to Don Quixote, arguably a text that is a paradigm for Carr's earlier acknowledgement of the moral ambiguity of great literary works, the authors helpfully intervene, I think on behalf of the teacher, to offer a definitive interpretation of a well-known literary moment. So here, we are told that the last touching moments of the narrative are evidently to the real point of the story. Now, earlier I claimed that Sanders had circled these problems of hermeneutic circularity, but not quite alighted on them. So this is from a 2014 paper, where Sanders raises the question, how do we know what an example refers to? Take a cloth sample in a fabric store. The sample is usually taken to exemplify colour, pattern and weave, but not size. The same can be said about a sample of human behaviour, which can also be interpreted in different ways. And then that extended second part, the important part, is underlined. Teachers who claim to be an example of virtue still depend on a social context of difference and similarity for their role modelling to be effective. So this hermeneutic circle of exemplarity is acknowledged. Even there's a very interesting recognition in Sanders elsewhere of the dark soil, if you like, of moral education, where he argues that we do not expect children only to copy adults, but to gradually, no, not that bit. What this suggests is that parents, friends or teachers do have a certain formative influence on our moral development, but we only realise their contribution to our development in retrospect. Only when we have acquired certain character traits ourselves can we identify educators who had similar traits and tell a story about how they contributed to who we've become. That's linking back to that circularity that I implied was recognised in Rousseau. However, I think Sanders circles but doesn't quite alight on the importance of this, because he offers a solution. This means that teachers will have to understand the moral significance of these character traits themselves and explain them to the pupils. So what the moral educator might see as the failure of a literary text or other exemplar to resist distortion or subversive understanding can instead, I think, be celebrated as an indication of the rich possibilities of children's imaginative capacity for interpretation. The hermeneutic circle, I argue, is not a problem to be overcome. It is a condition of the possibility of understanding. No exemplar can be recognised as such outside of a frame that takes in a child's background understanding, their moral experience, and importantly, because no child ever learns their morality from a single text, although we might recognise in character education an earlier model where only one text, of course, was necessary. The dialogue between a particular literary exemplar and the broader range of a child's literary awareness and experience. The complexity of the difference between a student's frame of reference and ours, interpreted as a problem of readiness to encounter a particular exemplar, is overcome in character education, it's alternatively suggested, by attempting to furnish a background understanding that is more similar to ours in important respects, or providing commentary, guidance, or dialogue on the exemplar as it is presented. In the second case, imagine that the teacher, as Sanders suggests, presents her own conduct as an exemplary text and then offers an explanation of this conduct. This explanation itself doesn't stand outside of the circular problem of exemplarity discussed so far. Rather, the teacher presents herself as a further kind of exemplar, and the interpretive relationship is further laminated and complicated. And that's precisely, in fact, what Rousseau says when he says that when you are giving moral commands, when you're exhibiting moral authority, you are in that providing an exemplar, which of course you don't expect the child to imitate. Now, within this open-ended relationship of interpretation, finality is achieved only by the authoritative imposition of a legitimate moral. Understanding of literary exemplars outside of explicit moral education rarely takes on the decisive character of self-consciously embracing or rejecting a literary character or action, although this might often be required for evaluating the success of a particular pedagogical intervention. So alternatively, we might see the relationship between the child and the moral exemplar as one of tentative adjustment rather than imitation. And I'm drawing here, can't see all of my screen, I've hidden the text behind some pictures here, I'll have to move it around. I'm drawing here on a bit of Dreyfus here, expounding Heidegger. Dreyfus says, people in various cultures stand different distances from an intimate, a friend, a stranger. This differs across cultures. Yet no one explicitly taught this pattern to each of us. Our parents couldn't possibly have consciously instructed us in it, since they do not know the pattern any more than we do. As small children, when we began to interact with other people, we sometimes got the distances wrong. This made our parents and friends uneasy. They either backed away or moved closer, so we gradually picked up the pattern. It was never made explicit. Yet this savoir-faire embodies rudiments of an understanding of what it is to be a human being. Now, I don't have time to elaborate this too much, but I think this is interesting because it shows how there can be a dialogic relation without it being explicitly propositional, without it even being cognitive, without it being able to be thematized. It's ontological in that it takes in the whole context of exemplar and interpreter. It embodies that to and fro relationship of adjustment. And importantly, what is taught is not taught consciously or even purposefully. With an eye to the time, I'm going to move into implications of my argument. I could perhaps elaborate on some of that in the questions. So the implications: against closure, structure, and empirical generalizations that might facilitate the planning and sequencing of moral pedagogical exchanges, I'm suggesting that character educators should pay close attention to the minimized elements of Chris Jansen's account of the dialogic nature of character education. We can reconsider the autonomy-heteronomy tension without needing necessarily to give up on moral education's directive aim or its commitment to moral realism. But we should note the dangers of a purposeful moral education that aims to arrive at particular dispositions or moral knowledge through particular stories or moments of exemplarity. Both teacher and student submit to the dialogue, to the emerging subject matter in a virtuous spirit of openness. And I would say that's an important element of the teacher's exemplarity, is to be exemplifying that submission to the dialogue and to what is unfolding. So I'm going to finally suggest that moral formation and the development of phronesis occurs in and through this dialogue. Using Gadamer's words, this is what happens over and above our willing and doing. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, thank you, David. Okay, I'm going to hand straight over to Bob. If I could just remind people to use the chat box if they want to ask questions. We will take raised hands. So I know London branch does a lot more raised hands, so we will do that as well. But Bob, I think, is going to talk for about 20 minutes as well.
Can you see my screen, colleagues, and hear my voice? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. Well, that, let me just say very quickly. First of all, thank you to David, who really thought this up, and to that ongoing conversation that he's talked about, which has gone on more years than either of us cares to count now. My interest, of course, in it goes back to my collaborations with David Carr and indeed with Jim Conroy before that on this relationship of literature specifically to character education and moral education. Indeed, work we first did with Marvin Berkowitz in Scotland in 1994. I've also been stimulated by Laura's earlier paper in this seminar series, which I think shows how alive the issues are, especially through the work of the Jubilee Centre. And also kind of unsettlingly struck by how the second of my examples, what I'm going to do some further exploration, has a peculiarly contemporary resonance, as I'm sure you'll recognise. So I'm interested really in the knightly virtues and how they are presented as a kind of narrativized form of character education. As a trained literary critic and medievalist, I want to go back to some of the sources and how they are used, and indeed in my two examples to show the way in which they formed character in a fashion that perhaps we would find less than appealing. And then like David, I want to draw some conclusions which I think converge with David in several respects. First of all, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. The Jubilee Centre project is an examination of stories of literary significance and how they might be used in primary schools for teaching and learning about qualities of virtuous character. As my earlier work with David suggested, I don't have any prima facie objection to that idea, although I maybe want to read it in a more nuanced way than some of the outputs of the research have suggested. 4 such stories are suggested in the study. That's the book and the report. Gareth and Lynette, El Cid, Don Quixote, and The Merchant of Venice. My own Arthurianly named son, incidentally, Gareth, is in the room. So you'll see how dear to my heart these traditions are. And then there's the list of 8 virtues. Again, you'll be familiar with this. It's been discussed in some very interesting texts, academic texts and professional texts over the course of the last several years. Now, looking first of all at Karen Harrison. Karen Harrison, let me be absolutely clear, recognised some of the limitations of the term knightly virtues. And they do acknowledge, especially in their book and in their CPD with teachers, the brutality of the medieval society from which the concept ultimately derives. More controversially, and this has received some criticism, including from academics who belong to different religious traditions, they acknowledge the moral basis of these medieval virtues in Christianity. Through principally the efforts of the medieval church to regulate war, predation, martial violence, and the rule of aristocratic force. Think of the peace of God and various times of the year where knights were adjured not to fight. They seem also to place themselves in a broadly Hegelian view that the medieval cult of chivalry, a rule-bound courtly construction of regulated violence, represents an ideological accommodation of earlier and more primitive European warrior ethics with Christian moral teaching and restraint. In my view, they occasionally risk the vice of integralism. Sorry, I spelt it wrong there. Integralism. Integralism is the belief articulated recently in this book by Andrew Willard Jones, that medieval society actually did not recognise the distinction between church and state in the way that traditional medieval historiography has argued, but a seamless fabric of the ecclesial and the secular under the rule of peace, a sacramental construction of peace. Now, this is a source of remarkable controversy in medieval history. The book has been attacked as well as praised. But there are actually some quite active integralist movements that have found their spaces in social media and other zones of the digital age. So really, my conclusion from that is that the project and the book, really to some extent, argue in very classical, literary, critical, cognitivist and virtue ethicist terms that despite their problematic origins, the knightly virtues embedded in the medieval romances are historically and morally transhistorical, transferable, and can assist contemporary child readers vicariously in acquiring and exercising these virtues in something like the way they moderated the excesses of medieval courtly society. And of course, they've amassed empirical and observational data and self-reported data and so on to validate these claims. The methodology I don't propose to discuss, but it's well documented in the report itself. So here's my first historicisation. And it's really drawn from the fact that the 2 of the texts, El Cid and Don Quixote, are Spanish. Spanish in inverted commas, given that in El Cid's time the concept of Spain was a very fluid one. My broad argument then is not really the same as David's. I'm less interested in verifying or disconfirming the merits of character education, and more interested in inviting character education when it uses literature to adopt a more intensive posture of historicisation. This historicisation begins with the texts themselves. In other words, I'm not suggesting that this is simply about context. I think this is the way the texts are constituted. The virtues seemingly exhibited in the Tale of the Cid cannot be disaggregated from the moral ambiguities of this narrative, or indeed its centrality to the highly problematic project of the protracted reconquista of the peninsula from the supposedly alien and heathen Muslim invaders. And you will be aware from some of the educational press colleagues, if you've acquainted yourself with it, that there's been some kind of anxiety in certain places about how, in a city like Birmingham, which is a large Muslim population, this medieval vocabulary might be received and processed. Similarly, the virtues seemingly on display in Don Quixote must be read with the grain of the disintegration of a late medieval, early modern cultural configuration observed by Cervantes, a kind of second crisis of feudalism, just as a new kind of hyper-violent Castilian global imperium emerged in the Mediterranean, the Americas, and the Pacific. And remember, Cervantes is a contemporary, almost direct contemporary of Shakespeare. And although I don't discuss The Merchant of Venice in this particular presentation, some of the same reservations I aver would apply there. So this is a crisis text, I would argue, an anti-romance crisis text that is the product of a transformation in the fortunes of this nation. And it's not merely of antiquarian interest, because the preservation, promotion, and exercise of these medieval Catholic virtues were subsequently integral to the expansion of the Spanish Imperium right through to the Francoist Civil War cruzada to rescue Spain from international communism in the 1930s. The same language was circulated, the same virtues were asserted by Franco and his army. They almost followed the same map as the Castilian princes in rescuing Spain from their version of a great evil. My second, I do wince now actually looking at this material because, as I said at the start of this presentation, it has a most unsettling resonance at this particular historical moment. So again, to repeat, I'm setting aside the standard philosophical objections that there might be to certain styles of character education in favour of a request for historicising another extraordinary example of their instantiation, their embrace indeed. The American act of historicisation is invited because one of the chosen texts and much of the project work around Romance literature is taken from the so-called Matter of Britain, the cycle of stories centred in King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Now I'm kind of riffing, you might recognise, on a quip made by Mark Twain that the principal cause of the American Civil War was Walter Scott, because the enthusiasm with which the southern states embraced European Romance culture was a major source of inspiration and resource for this society First, as it rested with its North American rival economically and culturally in the full throttle embrace of industrial capitalism, and then as it sought an explanation for its own adversarial response to the perceived threat of the abolition of slavery. First of all, the historicisation begins again with the texts themselves. The virtues seemingly exhibited in Gareth and Lynette, if you choose to familiarise yourself with the story, cannot be disaggregated from medieval conceptions of courtship, martial rivalry, social and gender hierarchy, and even, and a term I use reluctantly, rape culture and possession. Certainly our ways of reading this text today must take account of these experiences we have had as a community of readers formed through our histories and our understandings of gender violence, hierarchy, property, possession. I don't see how these can be left behind in an attempt to retrieve some account of the virtues that particularly Gareth acquires and exercises. This might lead us to view the virtues differently when we recognise their cultural penetration of the values and the cultural practices of the conservative states of America, the scale of which is sometimes difficult to comprehend. And I've referred colleagues to the work of Eugene Genovese. It's self-controversial work, let me tell you, because some critics believe Genovese, who's been writing for many years, has kind of been seduced by some of the features of the Southern society and Southern civilization that he documents with such patience and detail. So what I mean here, of course, is that Southern agrarian planter culture embraced Arthurian romance as a training literature in the formation of virtuous gentlemen and ladies, the Southern gentleman, archetypally represented, of course, in Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind and the famous Hollywood adaptation of that. And in declaredly sharp contrast to the supposedly modern bourgeois industrial free labour capitalism of the northern states, with which, of course, the Confederate States of America eventually engaged in mortal struggle. Let me dwell on that for just a moment. This is not leisure and recreational reading or simply the textbooks of the elementary classroom. It's an ideological posture, an identification of how the individual is formed within this society. This society, remember, the middle of the 19th century, the second stage of the Industrial Revolution, which is still practicing slavery, but which presents itself as the agrarian opposite of this industrial monster of the North, which was, and their language often sounds almost Marxist in its denunciation of the dehumanizing practices of the factory and the squalor of the great eastern towns and cities. Against this, these ladies and gentlemen stood for a different set of virtues, a different set of attributes and qualities that bound the individual to community and society. The sophistication and presumed moral excellence of this virtue-trained Southern society failed somehow to awaken it to the abomination of chattel slavery in its midst, and propelled it to the defence of this nationally defining institution in affirmatively knightly fashion. And in other work, I've looked at the language used, the martial language used to rally the Army of Virginia in 1861, which is expressly the language of knighthood, the language of chivalry. And of course, the most destructive war the Americans have ever fought, with a higher death toll than all other conflicts in which America has been involved since. And finally, colleagues, my implications, tentative though they are, though advancing though they are, also, let me say, since I first gave this, an earlier version of this paper in Barcelona, that I'm not objecting to the Horatian Augustinian idea that imaginative literature can instruct in the virtues under certain conditions. Let me again pause there for a moment. I use that term rather than Aristotelian quite deliberately, because it's through Horace, it's through Horace's Ars Poetica, that the belief that literature delights and instructs is transmitted to literate culture in Europe and in the British Isles, in waves of appropriation and waves of polemic. Sir Philip Sidney's defence of poetry, right down even to Shelley's defence of poetry, when, you know, poets and writers are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Literature has this power to please, and Horace uses different Latin formulations in the poem, to please and to instruct in the virtues. That's one of its chief purposes. Neither do I dismiss to court the controversial moral educational notion that character and virtue might be formed in the reader, as it were, formed in the child through the vicarious engagement with virtues and vices in action within such literature and story. David's already helpfully suggested the nuanced way in which I would read that, along with the earlier work of David Carr. I continue to wrestle with it, let me say, and that's why this project sees my work and David's converging. But, this argument does suggest that in undertaking this method, the historicisation of the text selected or invoked is essential, because history is not mere context to them. It constitutes them. History and literature are seen in these examples to exist not in a relation of mimesis. It's not merely a reflection of a society. It's the production of a society, the production of a worldview. A circulation, exchange, mutual constitution model of the place of literature and literate education in the formation of young people as readers and as learners more generally. Finally, the knightly virtues, even if the title is set aside, and I know that some of its supporters are prepared to do that, and their uses are inseparable from the tensions, dilemmas, displacements, and objections of courtly feudal culture more broadly appraised, and as the examples show, that can erupt into history and into our moral lives in the most paradoxical and even destructive ways. I'm suggesting, finally, that this is not an option in implementing this style of character formation. It's an obligation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you to both of you for those presentations. I was wondering, especially for Bob, so in my impression, what you're suggesting or the argument you're producing is pointing towards basically a cultural relativity of the understanding of those virtues. So even though the knightly virtues of, I don't know, gratitude or courage, maybe we can agree on those words to denote some nice things. Sometimes we would maybe agree on that. It seems that the understanding what that actually means is very different depending on times, depending on cultures. So whereas all the things you pointed out, like the real understanding of those knightly virtues in the actual context, shows an understanding that we maybe would not totally agree to. So they still would call all this gratitude and courage, but it does show sides that we would not agree to, obviously. So it turns out that those virtues are basically relative to culture. Now that, in the end, the question then becomes, so, and Laura already pointed out that neo-Aristotelians recognize that virtues are culturally contextualized, or virtues are culturally contextualized. The question then, of course, becomes to me, why would we keep using those words? What remains? What do we gain by actually keeping using those words, even though we realize that the context where they have been basically invented is not a context that we share. It's not an understanding that we can share today. So why would we keep on using words like honor or courage to denote something positive? Yeah, I think that's my question.
If I mean the answer is yes and more, Karsten. That seems to me to be the moral educative act. That's the conversation we have, or it's certainly included in the conversation through which we arrive at some kind of coherent understanding of what might continue to make these terms meaningful for us. That's moral philosophy. That's ethics. That's what we do. I don't see this as an insurmountable task by any means. It actually is what we do. Almost always in a dialogue with young people, those questions will be presented by the young people themselves. One of the first times I talked to young people about Aristotle, some wise guy in the classroom said, "But didn't he live in a society that allowed slavery, Mr. Davis?" So of course, but where I want to go further is the use of literature. This seems to me, in certain forms, to be a misreading of literature. This is not what happens when we read texts, and it is not what is actually going on in the texts themselves. So it's the act of reading, Karsten, that I'm principally interested in here, that needs to be far more complexified and far more, well, Laura's used an important word, ambiguous, in a previous conversation. It's that ambiguity that I think that needs to be embraced in the act of reading, rather than simply wrestling with the fact that, well, what somebody meant by gratitude in the 16th century might be different from what we mean by gratitude in the 21st. Let's take that for granted. It's what we do with texts that I think is the chief area of difficulty here.
Yeah, just as a comment, that if we do that, if we take that for granted, I'm very much for that, like to read those texts basically with a much more well, critical eye, or much more like I don't know, deeper. The question is what remains then from those notions, because as it seems, the people who use those notions as in a list of virtues, those texts you are referring to, that's the only thing they have. So if we kind of start to dissect those texts and realize those virtues, all the things all the people who come up with those lists are referring to those kind of texts, not much is left then, which I would find quite good. But I'm not really, yeah, I wouldn't see what people then can use to make up those kind of lists then. Which I think was a good outcome, but not everyone might agree.
I'm going to stop there, just in the interests of the queue of questions. But yeah, I hope I get a chance to come back to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
if I can come in quickly.
Yeah, sorry, David.
Carsten's suggesting, you know, if you take that away, what's left for, if you like, the whole project of a character education that deals explicitly with any sort of list of virtues. Yeah, I kind of think that's one of the things I'm pointing towards. I allude in the presentation, but I haven't developed it here, to that whole theological history of the whole project. I mean, the model of reading is predicated on an earlier model of interaction with the text, where one book did suffice to teach virtue. And I think we need to sort of excavate that theological history, which precedes all of these interactions that even Bob is talking about, I think.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Laura, you've already been noted in the previous conversation. Do you want to come in with perhaps both the points that you made, because I think they're linked in the chat?
Well, I think Carsten summed those points up really well, but I'm fascinated by what Dave just said. I've already moved on, sorry. I really liked what both Bob and Dave have said about it's what we do with them that matters. It's having a dialogue and how we use them pedagogically that makes a difference. Because it seems to me that, you know, just, I mean, sort of like Aesop's fables, if you just sort of say, here's the moral of the story, don't do this, don't do that, you're not actually inculcating virtues. You're just sort of having some rules that might have to restrict behaviour, which can be pragmatic, but it's not the same thing as character formation. But in terms of, I've got two ideas going on here, but one was the theological background to some of these, you know, philosophy and the virtues that they're pointing to. You know, if you go back to the way that it's taught in, say, a Catholic university, they teach that sort of Jesus was the first real virtue ethicist. And that was the idea of this exemplar, where you're just watching moral people behave in a certain way and treating people in an inclusive, friendly, kind, loving manner. And that this is something that we learn to do. But, you know, once you have the sort of Aquinas take on, you know, grabbing Aristotle, grabbing Plato after Augustine, and then putting Aquinas on there, then you get to something that does sound more deontological, I think, in my mind. It sounds more like kind of categorical imperatives, and you get natural law theory. So I think we need to be mindful that there are different strands in the tradition of virtue ethics and natural law theory. And yes, you know, I think it's quite helpful to see the history of philosophy and where they've come from. But I'm interested in what we do with them now. And so Bob's challenge is, well, we can't just go back to the old-fashioned way of thinking about it, the old-fashioned story, and expect them to work immediately. But what about some of the, you know, if this is still a story that appeals? I mean, from my understanding, Bob, you obviously know more than I do. Something like courtly love is a literary invention. It's a play of the imagination. It's not something that really was happening widespread in the real world. But as you said, there are some scary current activities that seem to be people playing medieval knights again. Like, you know, we look at America and this kind of thing. So I'm wondering if you get people who have this, you know, inclination to certain kinds of modes of activity, can we get the stories again and reconsider them and get a conversation going that helps them to reflect on whether these behaviours actually do play out in positive, constructive ways or not? That was a bit of stream of consciousness. Sorry if there was a lot in there.
I think probably David should go first, actually, and then I'll come back to the actual examples.
Fine, yeah, and maybe you can. I'll respond to some bits and also to things I was thinking about in relation to what I think you did pick up on it now. So you suggested in the question in the chat that it was a bit of a straw man. You know, right at the start of what you said, you're like, well, of course, if it just means telling the story and driving home its meaning, then we've moved on from that. But you know, I would contest that that's not a straw man, because that's the literature that I'm responding to. I mean, even in Knightly Virtues that Bob talked at length about, a central section of that book is a detailed summary of the key stories and ideas of the source material and an explanation of the virtuous content, which I think is really interesting. I wonder if it's intended as a resource for busy teachers, you know, who haven't got time to read Don Quixote. So here's the moral messages that you should be drawing from the story, and that is there in the literature, and so I am responding to that claim that a particular resource can be used in relation to a particular moral message, because I think that is there. You picked up on the theological bit, and I would say that's just because I'm drawing on hermeneutics. That's familiar to me within the history of hermeneutics, is that your whole relation with a text in the Western hermeneutical tradition is in some way conditioned by that originary relation with text. And I would say that hermeneutic, that there is a truth in moral exemplarity, which students can be guided to elicit, I think, is there in contemporary character education. Actually, Gadamerian hermeneutics offers a new way of looking at that. So Gadamer's been called the secular Luther. He's still all about truth. He's still all about the text as a teacher, but the way in which the text constitutes an engagement with truth is by being constantly made new in the encounter. That's how a classic maintains its vitality, because there's constantly new understanding. So my practical guidance is to steer teachers away from those programs and resources that offer this text for this moral message with this accompanying explication. I don't think that picks up on everything you asked, but maybe Bob can pick up on some of the other bits.
It's fascinating, and just confirms for me, I think, an instinct I had after your own paper, that we probably converge on as many things as we diverge. Laura, I think, you use the example of courtly love. I think at root I disagree, because this is my point about literature's relationship to culture not being a mimetic one. These literatures are involved in the cultural production of manners. This is indeed why Tolkien and Lewis deliberately tried to create an Oxford curriculum that was an anti-modernism one. They didn't like the modern world. They wanted to push it away and force students to study literature from Beowulf to Spencer, and retrieve lost courtly manners and courtly virtues with which modernity could be resisted. And of course, others were doing precisely the opposite. So you two rival curricula. So in medieval society, this literature became a model of how to organize your court, how to organize the relationships between men and women. Now, in a sense, that vindicates a fundamental claim of character education, that literature can do things. It can be culturally active and salient. But my point is, you can't simply take one bit without the others. These texts are all fundamentally military. They're about men who carry weapons and kill other men. And similarly, the Spanish appropriation of these texts is inseparable from a revanchist understanding of the nation state and of how masculinity is configured within that nation state, that then of course becomes the basis of a brutal empire in the Americas. So I am going with you in this sense, that I want deep reading. And I want deep reading of these texts that's armed with this knowledge, equipped with this knowledge, and ready to enter into the place of ambiguity, the liminal site, as Jim Conroy calls it, where there's fluidity, uncertainty, contradiction, where you read Gareth and Lynette and you can, of course you can admire the extraordinary fortitude and patience that Gareth exhibits, but you can also understand, what is this telling us about how this society understood hierarchy, understood why you can despise a kitchen boy, but you don't despise a knight, And isn't there something problematic about that? And what about the strange gender reversal that actually is the antithesis of what would happen in this society, in the government of relations between men and women? So it's that kind of reading. I still think you can do that in a way that meaningfully addresses the virtues, but I don't think you can do it through the kinds of pedagogies that I've seen favoured in this movement.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes now. Now got 4 or 5 questions coming in. So can I ask David Lundy if he'd like to ask his question?
Hi, thanks very much, David and Bob. That was fascinating. I suppose, Bob, you're getting into, I think, the real core of the challenge of using literature in its context. And I suppose I want to kind of push at that a little bit and just ask, how far can we go in terms of having a text or using any kind of historical text? We're in a period where there's an enormous amount of censoriousness of people in St. Louis, Missouri, trying to pull down statues of St. Louis, you know, because of his association with anti-Semitism, with feudal slavery, with all of the things that, you know, were part and parcel of the medieval experience, the medieval world in which he lived. And of course that goes right up to the very recent past, and people starting to take down things like Little Britain that were written 20 years ago but have characters in blackface. Is there a point at which it's possible to look back at the past? Is it possible to use historical fiction in that sense to teach about morality without constantly being struck by the shortcomings of any given period? Or without being constantly struck by the moral shortcomings of the present age as well?
That's a brilliant question, David. As very quickly, my answer would be, I am most certainly not a statue remover. Now, that's not a blanket position. There might be certain conditions under which certain statues should be removed. I'm prepared to entertain that. But it's a really interesting way into this question. And of course, it is a literary one. There are students refusing to read Chaucer, the foundation of the Middle English canon, because Chaucer faced what we might call a not proven rape charge. The rape charge was dropped just before it went to court. It was clearly some kind of out of court settlement. So he's a rapist. We should stop reading his books. My position is emphatically the opposite of that. My position is, it's not that we do not read this literature. And of course, it's also, let me say, the delectio part of the Horatian formula. This literature, even to me now as a middle-aged man who's been reading all of it for many years, still makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and I still want to read it aloud to the young children in my extended family. But aside from that, I want to do precisely the opposite of what you're saying. I want to go into those texts and do this thing called reading. And that act of reading has an immensely important moral dimension, even possibly a moral underpinning. But we conduct that act, we perform that act of reading alone or as a community of readers, with those additional capacities that I'm simply asking to be brought to bear on the texts. That's not, remember, I'm not talking about background knowledge or context or did you know that. I'm talking about the texture, you know, that texere, weave. It's a weave and weft of language that's in the language, in the characterizations, the relationships, the dilemmas, the crises, the violence itself. That's what I'm asking for.
Can I come back though? Doesn't that essentially mean that you have to do all of the moral education, all the moral character formation prior to reading the text?
I don't know. And remember, I'm not suggesting. I sympathise with the view that the act of reading I'm alluding to is a morally active one. Well, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we switch off our moral concerns, our moral antennae, simply because we're doing this racy thing called reading, which might have men killing each other and violence and racism and or sectarianism in it. Otherwise, we'd stop reading. And I have no problem either with the community of readers, particularly the pedagogical community of readers, being one that arrives at important moral conclusions. I'm simply suggesting that you cannot get to these meaningful moral conclusions without bringing to bear, without letting the text speak its whole self to you. And that includes these ambiguities and paradoxes and dilemmas.
Can I come back just on David's second question there? Because I think that question you asked, you know, what comes first, the moral education or the engagement with the text, is a problem in character education. It's an aporia, if you like. It's something that the writers explicitly or implicitly struggle with. You know, there's that whole question of readiness. In part, it's sort of deferred by saying first habituation, then explicit discussion, but that doesn't really solve it, because as Christiansen acknowledges, habituation itself is dialogic. You know, and there is that what comes first problem. So there's that. There's a good example, I think, is in, maybe it's Kilpatrick, maybe it's Licona, I can't remember exactly who talks about it, but there's one of the writers brings up A Night to Remember. I passed over it on my slides. I've never actually seen A Night to Remember, I'll acknowledge this, but says, you know, this work is so powerful, it's such a great, and he's talking about watching the film, it's such a powerful resource, that just watching a 20-minute excerpt of this will kind of work its artistic magic on a group of sixth formers and reduce them all to tears. So on the one hand, there's that suggestion that, you know, the sufficiently high quality artworks will just do their job. But then on the other hand, he wants to make that point that actually moral understanding is hard won. You know, the reason why we don't see the kind of character we want is because people don't have these stores of interpretive resources to draw on. And so actually there's something there which is a bit like E.D. Hirsch. I think there's a close relationship with E.D. Hirsch there, with the suggestion that you need to furnish the background so that you can then go and do the interpretation. And that to me is just a problem, because there's never a point where you furnish the background. It's always circular. It's dialogical all the way down.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Aidan.
Hi, yeah, really interesting. Thank you to both speakers and the discussion afterwards. Just for some context, I do work in the Jubilee Centre, have worked in with most of the people that have been referenced as being part of the Jubilee Centre, so and was on the Nightly Virtues project. Not to defend it in any way, not that I feel the need to, but a lot of the questions that we are talking about today were things that came up during the project. I'm sure those that know David Carr can imagine some of the debates that we were having during the time.
Indeed.
And since then, I think the conversation that we've had since I posted my question has moved on a little bit, but I still would like to ask a version of it, if that's okay. Maybe this is oversimplifying, but given what we're talking about and what Bob has said in terms of doing deep dives and deep readings of text as being the most beneficial way to get the most out of text, and as a reader and just generally, I would fully subscribe to that. But thinking about the educational potential and the educational usage of such texts, is that possible in schools? And if so, is there a single text as an example that we could draw on that is good in that way, that maybe all children or all teachers should be using? There's been a huge amount of discussion, and I must have had about 10 or 15 questions written down about some of the nuances and things that we've been discussing. However, maybe just follow that up with one secondary point, which is, if context is really important, or if it isn't important, if historical accuracy is important, is the issue, if there is an issue with the Knightly Virtues project and the series of stories that we use in that, is the issue with the stories themselves as they were selected and as they exist, or is the issue with the retelling of those stories that we did as part of the project?
I'll go first, but just briefly, it's a very rich question and merits more space than we have here, Aidan. And you know, I think of myself as a critical friend of the centre and its work. And you know, anyone from my background is going to be thrilled that there's millions of pounds worth of money to support reading and texts, and indeed texts that are otherwise pretty marginal to the modern syllabus. So I like that. I hope it's clear from this presentation that it's not the texts, it's some of the assumptions and some of the methods in action that I think merit pause for thought. And in a sense, it's about trusting what David Aldridge has had to say about how we actually read and how young people actually read. I think in a certain sense, the Jubilee Centre can have its cake and eat it. It can do this work, but I think it would be immensely enriched if it simply recognised that there's all sorts of simultaneous processes going on in the texts themselves, in the way they have been received by the cultures out of which they emerged and by the cultures which subsequently maintained and in some sense canonised them, and in the way we are likely to find ourselves and our culture and our lives being opened up by them, problematized by them, questioned by them. I didn't mention it, although I've got a separate presentation on it. I think The Merchant of Venice is completely misunderstood in the project. The Merchant of Venice seems to me essentially to be about Shakespeare's recognition that a new kind of society was emerging in which the moral solvent of money was abolishing the Middle Ages and all its moral, reported moral virtues. It seems to be an enormously challenging text in which to do that, and yet it is, of course, unlike the other texts, a regular feature of upper secondary school study of Shakespeare. It is a text that addresses questions of race, of gender, of power, in ways which do resonate with the multicultural society in which we live. There's some very interesting accounts of teaching the Merchant of Venice in Birmingham by teachers themselves. So I want to say go for it, but go for it in a way that allows you to raise the kinds of themes and issues you want to raise without curtailing what the act of reading actually entails when you're in the presence of a text like The Merchant of Venice in 2020. That's all really I'm asking for.
Yeah, thanks Bob, can I come in there as well? So yeah, thanks for that question. So I would say any text is good, but no particular text is good. Yeah, no particular text does a particular job. And I think that's a difficult thing to say when a lot of your intervention research is going to be about selecting texts, explicating the ways that they could be useful for moral education, and then evaluating their success. But I would push that. That's my particular issue, is that, you know, any text can be used for interesting moral discussions, but the suggestion that this text helps us to understand this particular virtue is the one. I mean, even that I'm happy with, but it's then, you know, having that. This is the text. This is our explanation of where you're going with this text, and we've got to see whether that was successful. I mean, a good example. So there's the Narnian Virtues project, of course, coming out of Leeds, and the Narnian Virtues project happens to use C.S. Lewis. That's fine, but along the way, then encourages particular activities. So, what is your Turkish delight, for example, being one of the activities. Now, of course, use C.S. Lewis, but do that in a context of being able to raise the kind of disgust, for example, with which Pullman reads that text. Now, if the conversation has space for that kind of response to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, then I think that's a valuable conversation. If the conversation needs to exclude that kind of response, because then the activity of moral exemplarity won't work unambiguously, then I think there are concerns. And just picking up on what Bob says, I think of course teachers of literature know how to do this. They do this all the time. They engage with these ambiguities, but they don't always think of what they're doing as being explicitly moral education. I think that's the danger. The danger is to come into that and say, well, if you're doing moral education, you need this kind of resource and this kind of approach. Actually, I think the approach that teachers of literature have already got is quite appropriate to moral education, and that's largely what teachers are doing when they teach literature. So I would say that the way I would like to support teachers in that project, and Bob and I both agreed that the project of moral education in and through literature is one that we are sensitive to, but it would be by engaging teachers in these discussions, you know, talking about how do you deal, if you're reading Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, with Pullman's take on C.S. Lewis, rather than providing resources for moral education.
Thank you. I don't want to take up any more time because there's only a few minutes left, but just to say that one very short thing is that they are things that we are aware of in the centre. Of course, the project was between 6 and 8 years ago, so I think if we did it again today, it would be different. But that if we're not reflecting some of those things that I would agree with you, Dave, then we need to work harder maybe as a centre to reflect those in what we're doing, because there's certainly things that we're conscious of when we're doing the work.
Okay, thank you. Just to say, David and Bob, we've got 2 questions and 5 minutes. So questions and quick responses. I'm going to ask Ilya and then Gary to afterwards do the questions. So Ilya, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really great. Just a brief question. I'm not even sure if it's relevant. I'm not so familiar with this field, but I was just wondering, so I can read it, regarding the kind of question of ambiguity sort of aspect of a story. I was wondering if there's a distinction to be made between something like maybe subtlety or something, I'm not sure if that's the right term, of which we would approve, which arises in part from like the wisdom you need to see the moral insights in a story, which like you gain by reading the story maybe, but you need also to approach the story, which conveys some amount of literary merit even on the story, and then something more like moral ambiguity directly, which maybe is less desirable, and the kind of thing Rousseau complains about regarding the fox and the crow fable in Emile. But I'd just be curious if that makes any sense, or what the presenters think about it.
David?
Yeah, so firstly, I mean, my reading of Rousseau, I mean, he doesn't have a problem with the ambiguity, he just has a problem, Rousseau this is, he has a problem with you expecting the fable to do a particular job. But I like this question. I'm happy with saying moral ambiguity, and by that, not implying anything bad, but only implying things that are good. You know, I think part of why we celebrate literature is because of its capacity to produce a sort of richness and diversity of interpretation. So in that sense, it's ambiguous, and in the sense that we would read it, you know, thinking about the moral issues, it's ambiguous in that sense. So I kind of don't think of that as a negative. I think of that as being part of what it is to read literature, is to engage with that ambiguity. I think subtlety, well, if it's subtlety in presenting a particular message, then again, that's the bit that I want to resist. So I'm happy with ambiguity.
I would just add very quickly. I wrestle with this, and I'm keen not to fetishize ambiguity. Ambiguity in texts is one thing. I'm sure each of us would be anxious if we had a public reputation for leading morally ambiguous lives. So I'm thoroughly in favour of pursuing the virtues, of pursuing principle, of looking for characters who live by principles in the text that we share with children. I think Dickens is particularly adept at that. But I think subtlety is a good rubric for what I'm asking for, because I think too often it's the subtleties of a great novel, the subtleties of a medieval romance that are lost in this process when we instrumentalize the text for other purposes.
Okay, thank you. And Gary, last question.
Thank you. So my question maybe is going more into the sort of realm of the general critique of character education, and how Bob and David's excellent presentations relate to that. So I was wondering about Nell Noddings and her general critique of character education, where she's basically saying that, as I was writing this question, actually, Bob, you talked about the wise guy who asked you about Aristotle and slavery, and I just wanted to kind of return to that, and to Noddings basically says that Aristotle, it's not just that he lived in a time where slavery was accepted. Her issue is that he specifically defended slavery even when his contemporaries argued against it. And I just wonder whether that role of oppression is dealt with in our understanding of character education and virtue. I think she also talks about the fact that Aristotle is quite specific in his politics, that it is the man's role, the man of the household should instill moral character in his wife and children, and that's the role of the man. And the wife and child are completely, they have no agency in that at all. So I guess her sort of question is whether modern character education that predicates itself on Aristotle essentially addresses that conflict, and whether virtue is just in fact a sort of elitist, paternalist concept, and how that relates specifically to the points that you're addressing in your presentations.
I'll give it to David. Gary's my friend and PhD student, so we can follow up, and since we're short of time, but there's a lot of philosophers' names mentioned there, David. It looks like your territory.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, so those problems with Aristotle are there. Chris Jansen argues for reading Aristotle selectively. Gadamer does that. I would do that as well. So I don't think there is a response in character education to that particular critique. But I'm kind of with Chris Jansen there, that we can pull from Aristotle what we want. We don't have to take him whole cloth. But that said, I think you're onto something. I don't talk about them at length because those critiques are already out there, but they are important critiques. You know, that I don't think character education is adequately critical about the selection of virtues. You know, emphasis on virtues like gratitude, I think, can play into a particular kind of political set of preoccupations, and I think is in danger of doing that. So I don't talk about that at length, but I think it is there, and it's part and parcel again of wanting to make explicit the particular virtues that are being developed in the engagement. I mean, if one is able to be more subtle about this in general, then I don't think the problems are so much there. So a good example is this whole emphasis on having a set of virtues that one develops explicitly has become part of the architecture of schooling, the literal architecture of schooling. Any number of schools around Brunel I can go into now, and literally written over the archway of the door, carved into the stone, is a list of the particular virtues that the school adheres to. And I'm nervous about having arrived at that list, which you then carve into the stone of the school, because I think when you explore that, when you talk to teachers about how you see these virtues, you then pull out all of the subtleties which are operative in the community, all of the ways that the teachers disagree about the importance of gratitude or resilience or whatever else, and one would hope that the teachers could model for the students that subtlety in their engagement and their openness to potentially being transformed. So yeah, I think that is definitely a danger, that in picking out these particular virtues that we're gonna deal with, you do risk hanging yourself to a particular kind of political preoccupation. Yeah.
All I would add in a sentence, Gary, publicly, is, and we can discuss this again, is something that I know would, from your own work, would agitate you. And again, find people in the Leeds project, the Narnia books text that have always fascinated me since I was a child. But these reports that, parents are saying after this project on The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, their children are better behaved at school, that they do the dishes more often at home, that they're not as restless. There might actually be really good reasons to be restless in school today. And I hope that by the time they get to the end of school, they've got a chance to be Crime and Punishment and be unsettled again.
Okay, thank you very much. Run a little bit over time, but can I, on everybody's behalf, thank David and Bob for excellent papers and a really good conversation. Thank you all very much. We're back again on the 17th of July with another virtual branch, but I believe you've got choices of London and Roehampton in between that. We're also online. Everything's on the PSGB website. So thank you, David. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody. See you all again sometime.
Cheers, everyone.